Nalapat has had to say.
Thank you very much. I must say that, Thomas, it's a little bit of a problem talking immediately after such a masterly presentation. And he's given some very, very good ideas. And I certainly hope policy makers in India and Japan will listen to some of his ideas and put them into implementation. I must say it was a brilliant presentation. And I'm really grateful to you for having made it. You know, I want to just go on sketch some the broader parameters on what we're talking about asymmetric threats. And we have this question about the maritime, about cyber, and about terrorism. So I want to briefly touch on all of them. But I would like to begin this by pointing out something that I think in our discussion of technicalities and our discussion of again, as I said, military to military or academic to academic, we forget, which is the political environment. And I'd like to say that Japan has had, if I may call it, a Shinzo Abe moment. You know, after a long period of political instability, today Japan has a fairly stable government. After a long period in which you had prime ministers who were essentially revolving door, you've got a prime minister coming back who seems to have captured the public imagination and who's therefore got a certain degree of viability in carrying through policies which his predecessors did not have. Now, in our country, we are still waiting for a Shinzo Abe moment. Possibly, we'll get the Shinzo Abe moment in 2014, but we haven't got it yet. But should we have a system in India which is as, in a sense, as clearly directioned as the system in Japan, then there's no doubt that the India-Japan relations are going to increase at a much faster rate than they have at present. So I just want to bring in that the core element of politics into a discussion and the core element of decisive political leadership and the ability of this leadership to translate policies into action and to translate ideas, that is what we have had from Professor Nagao, into action. Now, let's go into the question of the maritime sphere. I think Lawrence is somewhere here, Lawrence Prabhakar, or has he left the hall? He's here. Good. You know, again, let me say that we are all talking about China. And quite frankly, it's the elephant in the room or the dragon in the room that I think it's important to talk about. And we're talking about the fact that China had a bargain with Japan, had a bargain with the United States, had a bargain with other countries, and that bargain was it would rise peacefully. It would not act as a military challenger to any of these countries. And as a consequence, it was freely allowed to enter the trade system and it was very freely allowed to develop its economic system. Now, we have seen the last paper, we have seen a lot of other evidence that possibly this bargain is now a thing of the past. That quite possibly the Chinese are entering into a period in which the PLA, for example, or a PLA kind of element is very dominant in policy. Now, we have seen that in the case of India. In the case of policy towards India, very definitely, whether it's China or whether it's Pakistan, the army is a very, very important determinant of policy towards India in both China and Pakistan. So, the army seems to be becoming a much more important determinant of policy, not only towards India, towards Japan, and now towards South China Sea, and many of the other countries in the periphery of China. India and Japan, yes, it was always the case that the military viewpoint was very strong. But now we find that that viewpoint is strong also in countries, other countries like the Philippines, for example, which by no stretch of the imagination can be deemed to constitute a threat to China. Even the Vietnamese by themselves cannot be deemed to constitute a threat to China. But we find the military influence on overall policy is definitely increasing. Given that situation, what is the way out? Now, obviously, you cannot build a very strong navy unless you have a strong economy. And therefore, you have to pay a lot of attention towards developing a strong economy. But there are, in some ways out of this, that some of us have been talking about, that Lawrence and I, for example, have been discussing for quite some time. And I'd like to share this with our Japanese colleagues here. And that is an idea which we have borrowed from the old Lend-Lease concept of the Second World War. You recall that during the Second World War, or just before the Second World War, the United States lent or leased naval ships to Britain and later on to the Soviet Union. The idea, of course, was to prosecute the war successfully and to ensure that the war was won by the Allied powers. Now, what we had in mind, frankly, was developing this kind of a concept in which you have surplus equipment, especially naval vessels. And this surplus equipment is transferred to India, Vietnam, and the Philippines in the first instance. And their naval capacities are very sharply built up as a course of this kind of transfer. Now, the purpose of this kind of a lend-lease would not be to win a war. It would be to prevent a war, on the clear expectation that we have got rational players across Asia, and that if there is a chance that it cannot be a one-way kind of street, then these rational players are not going to provoke and create a conflict. The point I'd like to make is that neither India, nor the Philippines, nor Vietnam, Japan of course is an exception in that, it's still a very wealthy country and is going to remain so for quite some time. We are not really in a capacity to build a navy sufficient to, in a sense, act as a deterrent to adventurism by the strongest Asian state. We're not going to be in a position for quite some time to build that kind of navy. And the only way this can happen is by a collaboration with the United States. I think the Japanese have got that. We have also got that. But for that, the Americans will have to look out of the box. They'll have to look at issues and they'll have to look at things out of the box. And one of the suggestions that we had, frankly, was this kind of a lend-lease. Now, of course, I'd like to tell our Japanese friends here that we have had a lot of statements about a strong India and about the United States building a strong India. And just as, you know, our Japanese friends have had a lot of statement about India and China being very close to each other, which are not reflected in visa policies, which are not reflected in industrial, license permits, which are not reflected in ease of operations in India. The fact of the matter is that these very sweet words from the US side have not really been matched by much concrete action, especially after President Obama took over as the head of the US government. I mean, George Bush was one particular period, Obama is a different period, and under President Obama, unfortunately, the entire drift of India-US relations, I mean, you know, Chintamani and others are experts here, the entire development of India-US relations has, in a sense, gone through a kind of a much slower pace. Whether it's space technology, whether it's high-tech technology, whether it's other aspects, many of these have actually gone on a much slower track than was the case under George Bush. So the question that we really have to ask when we discuss about maritime security, even when we're discussing the context of the United States, how far are the Americans willing to go in order to ensure that there is a system in Asia which protects the kind of security that we're looking at and which deters the kind of aggression, that potential aggression that we're looking at deterring. How far are they willing to go in this kind of a concept? Because baby steps are not going to work. You need out-of-the-box thinking. You need quite different approaches. And I think these approaches have got to be there. So on that side, is Washington ready for that kind of an approach is a question that we have to ask ourselves before we turn to other options, frankly. And these options have been taken, has been stressed by him about cooperating among each other. But again, the bottom line and what I'd like to say, so far as maritime security is concerned, any amount of cooperation among each other is welcome, but the lift will come. The real force multiplier will come if this kind of a cooperation also has wholehearted US cooperation in some of the out-of-the-box ways. Now, let's turn to a different kind of thing, and that is cyber. You know, we have recently had the Snowden case and other matters regarding cyber. Now, I mean, I've written about this actually. There is one aspect of the Snowden revelations that have really not been touched upon very much. A lot of attention has gone into the question of personal secrecy and internet secrecy and personal data being revealed on the net to the NSA, etc. The point is actually business secrecy. At least in my country, a large number of sensitive business transactions, including transactions of Indian companies involving American companies, take place using Gmail, Yahoo, Hotmail, in the personal accounts of many of these people, or even in the company accounts, and all of this are visible to interception by the NSA. So the question that is obviously there in one's mind now, in our case, in my case, I came across this whole question about corporate snooping when we analyzed some bids that OVL, that is our oil company, had done along with the Chinese. And we found the Chinese were giving bids just a little ahead of the Indian bid. In 2 or 3 instances, Homies, I'll specify those instances to you, we found the Chinese bid was just a little ahead of the Indian bid. Now, it's very difficult to get this kind of just a little ahead of the Indian bid once, twice, thrice, unless there's some hacking and snooping. The point is, this kind of thing obviously takes place through the NSA as well. In other words, it's not just counter-terrorism. It's also, in a sense, beefing up one's economic competitiveness and the economic competitiveness of one's companies vis-a-vis challengers in Asia through the use of snooping and entering into these cyber systems. So I think this is something where India and Japan have a very important stake. Japanese business is very, very crucial. Indian business is very, very crucial. And I think both these countries need to work very closely together to ensure that our cyber networks, especially those networks not only dealing with military, but dealing with commerce, with industry, with business. I mean, let's take the personal aside. Your personal life or my personal life, let's take that aside. The question is business competition. Some competitor in the United States or countries that the United States gives this data to, maybe Germany, maybe France, maybe Britain, they should not get an unfair advantage because the NSA is snooping on emails exchange between executives of this company to each other on Gmail accounts. Now, it's reasonably certain that there is a lot of inferential kind of evidence on that. As a person who's been a journalist sometime, I ran the story because I was convinced that we had enough inferential evidence that this kind of business-related cyber snooping is a major problem. And so far, we have not come across any evidence that this kind of thing to help business has been shared between the United States and Japan. We have found it's been shared between the United States and British companies, French companies, German companies, but till today, I have not come across any bit of information that this kind of thing has been shared with Japanese companies to improve their capacity. So in other words, this is also, let me go beyond this question of hacking and beyond the question of military hacking because it's been covered extensively. And I want to talk about something totally different, which is the business field. Because ultimately I can tell you, whether it's China, whether it's Japan, whether it's India, social stability depends on economic progress. If we don't grow at 6%, 7%, if the Chinese don't grow at 8, 9%, we are in deep trouble as a society over time. So for us, growth is important, and in that growth, the industry, commerce, trade is very important, and the competitive edge that Asia has got should not be lost as a result of cyber snooping. So this, indeed, is one more thing, quite frankly, in which I believe India and Japan can certainly work much closer together. As I said, I don't want to take too much time because we had a brilliant presentation and I'm really glad I've given a lot of my time to our Japanese colleague. We have learned a lot from him. But let me, Homis has very correctly raised about a lot of issues regarding terrorism, and he is, in fact, in this room, I would say, he's far and away the best expert in the subject. So I'm not going to dare to try and challenge him on that. I just want to raise one particular theater of operations, and that's Afghanistan. Now, we are facing a lot of problems on the border. The Pakistan army is getting much more frisky. They're sending people a lot more. They're creating a lot more problems. And the suspicion is they're basically doing this because they believe they have NATO over a barrel. Specifically, the Americans over a barrel. That without Pakistani goodwill, they're not going to be able to extricate their troops or their supplies from Afghanistan. So until these troops and supplies are extricated from Afghanistan, the Pakistanis believe that the Americans are going to keep us quiet, even if they create some problems for us. The Americans are going to keep us quiet so that we don't provoke Pakistan. So in a sense, it's a kind of blackmail. And they believe that they have a clear 1 year or more than a year to go, where they can create this kind of multiple problems for us, and they can rely on the Americans and on the NATO powers to tell us, please don't react, please don't be, of course they keep doing that even without any withdrawal from Afghanistan, and they are probably doing that in a much more advanced way these days. So That is what is happening in Afghanistan is the first stage. The second point about Afghanistan is we have this huge debate taking place about negotiations with the Taliban. On the one hand, you have got awards given to Malala Yousafzai. On the other hand, you are setting up a Taliban office in Qatar. On the one hand, you are saying very clearly that what is happening. I mean, on the one hand, your soldiers are being blown up every day. On the other hand, you are saying that you must include them in the government. Now, I want to say very clearly, if you include the government, I mean the Taliban and the Afghan government, what limited knowledge we have of Afghanistan, there is no way that government is going to function in a rational way. They will just come into the government to sabotage it from within. They will come into the government to reduce it to irrelevance and to reduce it to chaos so that ultimately they can become stronger and stronger. The point I'm trying to make is there is no question of a compromise with terrorism and with those who are indulging in terror. There is no good terrorist or bad terrorist. There is no half terrorist or whatever. If you have a terrorist force that is killing your soldiers, that is destroying human life, and that is creating multiple societal problems, that has got to be confronted. And in this kind of a process, we hope that the Japanese will stand with a stand which says very clearly that you have to help the people of Afghanistan. We have to help the people of Afghanistan in such a way, quite frankly, that they can be enabled to protect themselves. Because the core point is, after having seen the Taliban in operation in Afghanistan between 94, 95, 96, and especially after 96 and 2001, there is, at least in my reckoning, no way in which the Afghan people as a whole are ever going to support or stand with the Taliban. I don't think that is going to happen. I think that's a danger which has been kept a little artificially alive. The reality is the Afghan people are as tired of the Taliban as people outside Afghanistan are. And in this kind of a situation, dealing with Afghanistan, my own belief is India and Japan can come very closely together. As I said, I want to just sketch 2 or 3 points, present certain ideas for discussion in the group, but I'd just like to conclude one single line, and that is that for those who say that India and Japan are natural partners, they are perfectly correct. We are natural partners. It's not just because we're democracies, it's because we share common threats. There are deep civilizational linkages and deep civilizational respect on the Indian side and on the Japanese side for each other. And I think that kind of a very deep foundation is very, very essential towards building a good relationship. Thank you.